Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not a scream, but the dead silence of a room when illusions are stripped away by reality. I never wanted the spotlight at my brother's wedding, but when my future sister-in-law turned me into a punchline for the elite, she awakened ghosts she could never comprehend. The exact second, a four-star Marine general dropped his crystal wine glass upon recognizing me, I knew her pathetic little game was over. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with no budget to continue operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and keep creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the video description or comments. My name is Eliza Guerrero, and I am 38 years old. The late afternoon Texas sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the sprawling Austin estate, casting a golden hue over a room drenched in fabricated perfection. The air inside the grand ballroom was heavy, thick with the suffocating scent of fresh white orchids, aged champagne, and the kind of aggressive, bespoke perfumes that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. This was the wedding reception of my older brother, Julian, and his radiant new bride, Chloe. To the untrained, starstruck eye, it was a flawless tableau of high society success, a merging of a rising tech empire with established, old money power. To me, it was a masterclass in gilded deception. Everywhere I looked, I saw hollow smiles, calculating handshakes, and eyes that constantly scanned the room for someone more important to talk to. I stood as far from the center of attention as the grand architecture allowed, tucked into the shadowed corner of the mahogany bar. I wore a simple, unadorned black dress that fell straight to my knees. It was deliberately unremarkable, an outfit designed to make me completely invisible amidst a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. I leaned against the polished wood and asked the bartender for a lemon soda, keeping my left arm slightly angled inward. The long sleeves of my dress were securely buttoned at the wrists, serving a highly specific dual purpose. Yes, they satisfied the upscale, conservative dress code of the evening, but more importantly, they concealed a jagged, silver scar running all the way from my elbow down to my wrist. It was a permanent, physical souvenir from a covert extraction in Eastern Europe that had gone violently off script several years ago. A sudden burst of high-pitched, heavily manicured laughter echoed over the smooth jazz playing in the background. A few feet away, Chloe held court with a tight circle of her bridesmaids, women who looked exactly as if they had been meticulously cloned in a luxury laboratory. Chloe adjusted the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone and tilted her head, her voice raised just enough to ensure the sound waves would crash directly into my corner of the room. "Oh, please," Chloe said, her tone dripping with manufactured pity and venom. "Julian is far too generous for his own good. He keeps her on the payroll out of sheer, misplaced family guilt. She is basically a third-rate computer repair person. You know the type. Resetting routers, fetching coffee, and untangling cables in the basement. It is honestly tragic how some people just cannot make it on their own and have to leech off a successful tech founder like my husband. I told him we should have just bought her a one-way ticket back home, but he insisted she attend." The bridesmaids offered a chorus of synchronized, sympathetic sighs, casting poorly hidden, sidelong glances in my direction. I did not flinch. I did not turn my head. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply picked up my glass of lemon soda and took a slow, measured sip. In the normal civilian world, such blatant, public disrespect might warrant a screaming match, a dramatic exit, or at least a thrown drink, but I did not live in the normal civilian world. For over 15 years, I had operated entirely within the darkest shadows of the Cobalt Vanguard Division, a highly classified intelligence and rapid response unit that did not exist on any government ledger, military record, or official budget. I had been trained by the most ruthless instructors to endure physical torture, psychological warfare, and weeks of sleep deprivation without ever breaking my composure. A spoiled heiress in a white gown throwing a verbal tantrum to impress her friends barely registered on my threat assessment radar. My pulse remained at a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute. The crowd parted slightly, and Julian emerged from the sea of guests. My brother looked every inch the brilliant tech visionary, clad in a custom Italian tuxedo that cost more than my first car. He spotted me, and even from a distance, I saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the brief flash of genuine annoyance before he plastered on a bright, practiced smile for the cameras flashing around him. He walked over, bypassing the empty space beside me to stand slightly in front, deliberately creating a physical barrier between my unremarkable presence and his glittering new family. "Eliza," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder with a hollow, performative warmth that did not reach his eyes. "I am glad you made it. Look, try to mingle if you want, but keep a low profile. Okay, Chloe's parents have a lot of highly important investors here tonight. We are talking billionaires. Just lay low, enjoy the free food, and please do not do anything to upset her family or draw attention to yourself. We need everything tonight to be absolutely perfect." He squeezed my shoulder once, a gesture that was meant to look reassuring to the onlookers, but that felt entirely like a strict warning, before turning his back on me to quickly rejoin his radiant wife. I watched him walk away, the icy carbonation of the soda burning the back of my throat. It was a profound, suffocating kind of bitterness that washed over me. I had given my entire youth to the shadows, bleeding in foreign dirt to keep this country safe, and bleeding in the digital trenches to keep my brother's fragile empire from collapsing into dust. I had been his silent, unwavering shield against forces he could not even begin to comprehend. Yet, in the blinding light of his ultimate success, I was nothing more than an embarrassing stain. I was a shabby, imperfect blemish that needed to be swept away into the darkest corner of the room, out of sight and out of mind from the people who truly mattered to him. The delicate clinking of crystal glasses and the low, arrogant murmur of wealthy guests faded into a dull, rhythmic buzz in my ears as the bride decided her indirect taunts from across the room were no longer sufficient. I watched the reflection in the polished mirror behind the mahogany bar as Chloe deliberately detached herself from her flock of identical, overstyled bridesmaids. Her expensive heels clicked sharply against the imported Italian marble flooring, each step heavy and calculated. She was moving in for the kill. She wanted a reaction, a visible crack in my armor to display as a triumphant trophy to her affluent friends. She stopped just inches from me, the overpowering scent of her heavy floral perfume aggressively invading my personal space. She looked me up and down, a cruel, highly practiced smile playing on her perfectly glossed lips. "You really wore that," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a loud, theatrical whisper designed specifically to carry to the women standing behind her. "I told Julian we should have assigned you a personal shopper. I suppose thrift store chic is the best we can expect on a basement IT salary. Try to stand behind the large floral arrangements when the photographer comes around. Would you? The lighting in this corner is very harsh on such cheap fabric." I did not reply. I took another measured, entirely calm sip of my lemon soda. But before Chloe could register my total lack of response or escalate her petty assault, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted violently. The massive double oak doors at the main entrance of the hall swung open with a heavy, resonant thud. The smooth, ambient jazz music seemed to instantly dip in volume, and the collective attention of the entire room snapped toward the foyer. The most anticipated guest of the evening, the ultimate status symbol for the bride's ambitious family, had finally arrived. General Marcus Thorne strode into the room, even entirely removed from the active combat zones of the Middle East. The man carried an atmosphere of absolute, terrifying authority that made all the civilian wealth in the room look incredibly fragile and silly. He was a towering, battle-hardened figure in his formal dress uniform, the dark fabric heavily adorned with rows of meticulously polished ribbons and gleaming medals that told silent stories of blood, sacrifice, and brutal survival. His silver hair was cropped close to his scalp. His jawline looked as though it were carved from solid granite, and his dark eyes held the sharp, unforgiving intelligence of an apex predator assessing a new landscape. Chloe's father walked briskly beside him, practically vibrating with eager pride, laughing loudly at something the general had just said, holding a fresh glass of deep red vintage wine out to him. Chloe immediately turned her back on me, her cruel, mocking smile instantly transforming into a mask of pure, dazzling joy. She smoothed the front of her designer gown and prepared to rush forward to claim her prize guest. But she never got the chance. General Thorne took the wine glass from her father, a polite, booming laugh rumbling deep in his broad chest as his steely gaze swept casually across the sprawling, opulent room. He took in the towering centerpieces, the cascading crystal chandeliers, and the glittering, wealthy crowd. Then, his eyes continued their sweep, completely bypassing the eager, approaching bride, and landed squarely on the dark, shadowed corner of the bar. His gaze locked onto mine. Time stretched, warping into a slow, breathless crawl. I saw the exact microsecond the polite social facade vanished entirely from General Thorne's weathered face. His booming laugh died instantly, replaced by a sudden, total silence that seemed to violently suck the oxygen out of the immediate vicinity. His broad shoulders went completely rigid under his decorated jacket, the heavy muscles in his jaw locked tight. He froze so abruptly that the momentum of his own arm betrayed him. The delicate crystal glass in his massive hand tilted sharply, and a thick stream of crimson wine splashed violently onto the pristine, cream-colored carpet. The sound of the glass shattering as it slipped from his loosened grip cut through the room like a gunshot. The red stain spread rapidly across the expensive fabric, looking distinctly like fresh blood in the brightly lit room. The sudden, chaotic violence of that spilled wine seemed to paralyze the surrounding guests. The people nearest to the entrance stopped talking entirely. Chloe's father froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open in shock. Chloe halted her eager march, a look of profound, deeply unflattering confusion washing over her perfectly contoured face. General Thorne did not look down at the broken glass. He did not look at the ruined carpet. He did not look at his wealthy host, or the paralyzed bride standing just a few feet away. He kept his eyes locked firmly, unblinkingly, on me. With slow, heavy steps that carried the intimidating weight of a military march, the four-star general began to cross the ballroom. The sea of billionaires, socialites, and tech executives instinctively parted for him, stepping back in stunned, heavy silence as he charted a direct, unyielding path toward the shadows where I stood. The quiet chatter died away completely, spreading outward from the entrance until the entire massive hall was enveloped in a breathless, suffocating hush. Every single pair of eyes in the room followed the general, completely bewildered as to why the guest of honor was ignoring the welcoming party, to approach the drab, invisible woman standing alone by the liquor bottles. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The imposing height of him cast a long, dark shadow over the polished wood of the bar. For a long, agonizing moment, he just looked at me, scanning my face as if desperately searching for a ghost he thought had been buried in the sand long ago. Then, General Thorne snapped his heavy boots together. He stood at perfect, rigid attention. "Agent Guerrero," General Thorne said. His voice was not loud, but it was deep, highly resonant, and carried a tone of absolute, staggering reverence that echoed perfectly in the completely silent room. "I do not believe my eyes." A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. I gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "General Thorne," I replied, my voice calm and completely even. "It has been a very long time." Chloe, desperate to salvage the narrative and reclaim the spotlight that had just been violently hijacked from her grasp, rushed forward. She forced a bright, trembling laugh, stepping directly into the small space between the general and me. "Oh, General Thorne, there must be some sort of hilarious misunderstanding," Chloe said, her voice high-pitched, incredibly strained, and trembling with barely concealed panic. This is just Eliza. She is Julian's little sister. She just works down in the IT department, fixing the internet servers and things like that. Come, my father has been waiting to introduce you to the board of directors." She reached out to lightly touch his decorated arm. A deeply patronizing gesture meant to steer him away from the embarrassing hired help. General Thorne did not just pull his arm away. He turned his head and looked at Chloe with a gaze so cold, so sharply devoid of any warmth, politeness, or basic human sympathy, that she physically recoiled. It was the terrifying look of a seasoned combat commander regarding a severely misguided, foolish private. He looked right through her, rendering her entirely irrelevant in her own lavish bridal gown. "Do not interrupt me," Thorne commanded, his voice dropping an octave, slicing through her forced cheerfulness like a serrated hunting knife. He turned his full, undivided attention back to me, his voice now rising, intentionally carrying to every single corner of the silent, heavily populated ballroom. "Can someone in this room," General Thorne projected, his tone laced with a dangerous, barely suppressed fury, "explain to me why a woman who holds the medal of iron discipline is standing in the back corner of this party like an unwanted stray? Can someone explain to me why the woman who single-handedly pulled 34 of my trapped Marines out of a burning hellscape in a hostile war zone exactly 4 years ago is being spoken to like a worthless servant?" The silence that followed General Thorne's explosive declaration was absolute. It was not the polite, expectant quiet of a wedding toast, but the suffocating, heavy stillness of a room that had just realized the floor beneath them was constructed of exceptionally thin ice. The atmosphere shifted 180 degrees in a matter of seconds. The very same guests who had spent the last hour casting derogatory, sidelong glances in my direction were now staring at me with a potent mixture of deep confusion, intense scrutiny, and palpable, crawling fear. In their elite, carefully curated world, power was measured entirely by offshore bank accounts, exclusive zip codes, and massive stock portfolios. But the man standing before me represented a raw, primal kind of power that money simply could not buy, and he had just placed that profound respect squarely at my feet, the comfortable narrative they had been fed about the pathetic. Charity K's sister was violently disintegrating before their eyes. A sudden desperate commotion broke the spell. Julian was frantically pushing his way through the frozen crowd, his previously flawless posture entirely abandoned. His face had drained of all color, matching the pristine white orchids that decorated the hall. A thin sheen of cold sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the light of the cascading crystal chandeliers above. He reached us, breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between my completely unreadable expression and the general's furious glare. "General Thorne," Julian started, his voice cracking slightly, attempting to desperately muster the charismatic authority he usually wielded in corporate boardrooms. "Is there a problem here, please? Let us move to the VIP lounge where we can speak comfortably." General Thorne slowly turned his massive frame toward my brother. The disgust radiating from the older man was practically a physical force. "The problem, Julian," the general growled, his voice a low rumble of warning thunder, "is that I have been speaking with you for 6 months about critical defense contracts, and not once did you ever mention that your own flesh and blood is a living legend within the Cobalt Vanguard Division. You paraded around this state, boasting endlessly about your technological empire, while keeping the primary architect of your actual security hidden in the shadows like a dirty family secret." A low, electrified murmur rippled through the gathered billionaires and politicians. The name Cobalt Vanguard Division was not public knowledge. It was a phantom whispered about only in the highest security briefings, a terrifying myth to those who did not possess the clearance to know the brutal, bloody realities of modern digital warfare. To hear it spoken aloud, and directly attached to the woman in the plain black dress, was a seismic shockwave. Chloe, however, was violently immune to the gravity of the situation. The realization that her grand entrance and her prized guest of honor had been completely hijacked by the very person she had dedicated the evening to mocking was twisting her perfectly contoured face into a mask of polite, barely contained rage. She simply could not comprehend this shift in power, and her massive ego absolutely refused to accept it. She stepped forward again, forcefully wedging herself back into the circle. Her smile was tight and brittle, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, deeply passive-aggressive light. "General, please," Chloe laughed, a sharp, grating sound that lacked any genuine mirth. "You are incredibly sweet to try and include Julian's sister in the military conversation, but you must be confusing her with someone else entirely. Eliza does not have anything to do with any secret divisions or whatever that is. She is just a low-level IT girl. She fixes the Wi-Fi bugs for Julian's company and manages the basic server maintenance. Really, it is a charity position. We just let her play with the computers so she feels useful and included." She delivered the words like poisoned darts wrapped in expensive silk, trying desperately to shrink me back down into the pathetic, manageable box she had built for me. She looked around at her wealthy friends, desperately seeking validation, waiting for them to join in her mocking laughter. But no one laughed. The room remained deadly quiet. I ignored Chloe entirely. I turned my head and fixed my gaze directly on my brother. I did not glare. I did not frown. I simply looked into his eyes, unleashing the full, crushing weight of our shared, bloody history. It was an invisible pressure, a silent, damning demand for him to finally, for once in his cowardly life, stand up and claim the truth. I watched the internal war wage across his pale face. He knew exactly what he owed me. He knew the immense sacrifices I had made to keep him sitting on his comfortable silicon throne. But under the scrutinizing, judgmental glare of his wealthy new in-laws and his furious bride, Julian crumbled. He swallowed hard, completely unable to sustain eye contact with me. He looked down at his expensive Italian shoes, the sweat on his brow thickening. "Well," Julian stammered, his voice pathetic, evasive, and weak. "Eliza's work is, it is quite sensitive in nature. It is heavily covered by strict non-disclosure agreements. It just was not convenient or appropriate to discuss it in casual social settings." He chose the middle ground. He chose the coward's way out, offering a weak, pathetic justification that appeased no one and only further insulted the brutal reality of my existence. General Thorne let out a harsh, bitter scoff that sliced right through Julian's pathetic excuse. The general turned his back on my brother, dismissing him as completely irrelevant, and addressed the crowd directly. His voice rang out with the solemn cadence of a battlefield eulogy. "Wi-Fi bugs," General Thorne repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He glared at Chloe with raw, unfiltered contempt. 3 years ago, my battalion was pinned down in a monsoon of bullets in a highly hostile sector. A high-tech cartel had hacked our defensive grid, locking our weapon systems and cutting our communications. We were completely blind and waiting to be slaughtered. This woman, he pointed a heavy, scarred finger directly at my chest, walked solo into that cartel's heavily fortified data compound. She bypassed security systems that would take an army of your highly paid corporate engineers decades to even begin to understand. She retrieved the crucial key code while taking heavy enemy fire, re-established our grid, and saved the lives of hundreds of my men. She did not do it for a paycheck or for corporate glory. She did it because she is a patriot and a lethal warrior. The ballroom remained dead silent. The staggering truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, casting a long, dark, and permanent shadow over the shallow glitz of the wedding reception. But Chloe's eyes darkened with a stubborn, vicious denial. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped her crystal champagne flute. In her rigid, superficial mind, she had already convinced herself that the old general was simply senile, confusing some exaggerated war movie plot with her husband's pathetic sister. Her perfect wedding was being ruined by this fabricated drama, and she decided right then and there that she would absolutely not allow it to stand. I could see the exact moment the poisonous decision crystallized in her eyes. She was going to wait for the formal dinner. She was going to stick to her original, cruel plan. She was going to humiliate me publicly during the main toasts, to prove once and for all that in this glittering world of extreme wealth, she was the only one who truly held the power, and I was nothing but dirt beneath her designer heels. The transition from the cocktail reception to the formal seated dinner did absolutely nothing to dissipate the heavy, suffocating tension that had firmly settled over the grand ballroom. Hundreds of guests took their assigned seats around massive circular tables draped in imported silk, their hushed, frantic whispers creating a low, buzzing static beneath the soft classical music playing from the string quartet. Waiters in immaculate white coats moved silently through the aisles, pouring highly expensive vintage wines and serving a flawless 5-course meal. But the appetite of the room had been thoroughly ruined. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It did not take long. As the main course plates were being cleared away, the main overhead lights dimmed to a dramatic, shadowy low. A bright, blinding spotlight suddenly pierced the darkness, illuminating the center stage where the towering, 5-tier wedding cake stood. Chloe stepped right into the center of that harsh circle of light. She had practically snatched the silver microphone from the hired master of ceremonies. Her face was flushed with a manic, desperate kind of triumph. She had spent the last hour stewing in the absolute humiliation of being sidelined at her own wedding, and she was now heavily armed and ready to execute her petty, vicious retaliation. "Ladies and gentlemen, family and esteemed guests," Chloe began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured affection that made my stomach churn. "Before my father gives his traditional toast, I wanted to take a very brief moment to share a special surprise gift, a little tribute, if you will, to the incredible, selfless nature of the man I just married, and the heavy family burdens he has so graciously carried upon his broad shoulders." Behind her, a massive wall-sized projection screen silently unrolled from the ceiling. A loud, sharp click echoed through the sound system, and a painfully bright image flashed onto the canvas, towering over the entire room. It was not a collection of heartwarming childhood memories. It was a single, massive, deeply unflattering photograph of me. In the towering image, I looked like a discarded corpse. My skin was a pale, sickly gray. My eyes were deeply sunken with heavy, dark purple bruising underneath them, and my hair was a tangled, greasy mess. I was wearing a cheap, badly frayed gray t-shirt that had a visible tear near the collar. I was completely passed out, slumped awkwardly with my mouth slightly open, dead to the world on a battered, stained leather sofa. The photograph screamed of absolute rock-bottom poverty, desperate exhaustion, and total failure. A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. A few people gasped quietly. Chloe paced across the stage, gesturing grandly to the massive, humiliating image of my lowest physical moment. "Julian is simply too kind and too modest to ever brag about his charitable heart," Chloe announced into the microphone, her tone shifting into a deeply patronizing, sorrowful register. "This picture was taken a few years ago, during a very, very dark period for his little sister, a time when she had absolutely nothing, when she could not hold down a job, when she was completely lost and broken. But my incredible husband did not turn his back on her. He took her in. He put a roof over her head. He gave her a fake little job in his basement just to make her feel useful. He has always carried the heavy financial burden of his sister, feeding her and clothing her when she was entirely incapable of surviving on her own." A scattered, highly uncomfortable ripple of laughter echoed from the tables closest to the stage, mostly from her sycophantic bridesmaids and the wealthy socialites who felt obligated to support the bride's cruel narrative. I did not look at the giant screen. I looked directly at Julian. My brother sat at the center of the head table, bathed in the soft glow of the table candles. He was entirely frozen. His hands were gripping his white linen napkin so tightly that his knuckles were stark, bone white. His jaw was clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter under the pressure. He knew exactly what that photograph was. He knew exactly what day it had been taken, and he knew the brutal, terrifying truth behind my exhaustion. Yet, he said absolutely nothing. He sat there, A cowardly, pathetic king sitting on a throne of lies, actively allowing his vicious new wife to publicly crucify the very person who had bled to build his entire empire. He simply stared down at his empty porcelain plate, refusing to meet my eyes, effectively burying the truth to save his own fragile ego. At my small, secluded table in the back corner, I remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. I rested my right elbow on the table and gently tapped my index finger against the rim of my crystal wine glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was a slow, incredibly steady, rhythmic beat. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not lower my head in shame. My heart rate did not elevate by a single beat. 2 tables away, General Thorne sat with his arms crossed over his decorated chest. His dark eyes darted from the massive, humiliating photograph on the screen, down to Julian's sweating, guilty face, and finally over to my completely motionless figure. The general's heavy brow furrowed deeply. He had commanded thousands of lethal soldiers. He recognized the exact, chilling stillness radiating from my body. It was the absolute, dead calm of a sniper who had just calculated the wind speed, steadied their breathing, and was firmly wrapping their finger around the trigger. He knew, with absolute certainty, that a massive storm was about to tear the roof off this building. Chloe turned toward the general's table, delivering her final venomous strike. "So, General Thorne," Chloe sneered into the microphone, a vicious, triumphant smirk locking onto her face. "I am not entirely sure what elaborate, ridiculous act she played to trick you earlier, or what delusional war stories she has been spinning, but in the reality of this family, Eliza has never been a hero. She has always been the pathetic, troubled child who constantly needs to be rescued by my husband's charity." She lowered the microphone down to her side, her chest heaving slightly, thoroughly incredibly satisfied with her public execution. She stood there, bathed in the spotlight, eagerly waiting for the inevitable breakdown. She was waiting for me to burst into tears, to cover my face in profound shame, and to run sprinting out of the grand ballroom, leaving her as the undisputed, victorious queen of the evening. Instead, I stopped tapping my glass. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the marble floor. I stood up, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. I took a moment to calmly smooth down the invisible wrinkles on my simple black dress. I walked smoothly toward a terrified, trembling waiter standing near the wall and gently slid the backup wireless microphone from his tray. I turned to face the stage, the massive screen, the hundreds of staring guests, and my cowardly brother. And then, I smiled. It was not a smile of joy, or embarrassment, or forgiveness. It was a cold, hollow, deeply Tanyan smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of an executioner who had just been handed a very sharp axe. I lifted the cold silver microphone to my lips. I did not tap it to check if it was on. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room was all the confirmation I needed. When I spoke, my voice was not a frantic, defensive scream. It was a low, resonant, and incredibly warm baritone that carried a bone-chilling frost. It echoed off the vaulted ceilings, cutting through the thick scent of expensive orchids and paralyzing every single guest in their seats. "October 14th, 2019, I said, my voice perfectly steady, entirely devoid of the emotional breakdown Chloe had so eagerly anticipated. I did not look at the bride. I kept my eyes locked onto the towering, pathetic figure of my brother. "That is the exact date this photograph was taken. It was a Tuesday. It was raining." I took a slow, measured step away from the shadows of my table and walked directly into the center aisle, moving toward the stage. The guests instinctively shrank back in their chairs as I passed. "I am not going to stand here and justify my existence to a room full of strangers," I continued, gesturing lazily toward the massive projection screen that still displayed my bruised, exhausted face. "But since we are sharing family memories, we should ensure the historical record is entirely accurate. That gray shirt I'm wearing in the photograph, the one with the tear near the collar, that was not bought at a thrift store. It was torn by a combat knife in a warehouse situated right on the freezing border of Ukraine. And those dark circles under my eyes were not the result of being a lazy, unemployed burden. They were the physical manifestation of being awake for exactly 48 consecutive hours, navigating a highly hostile, completely off-the-grid digital war zone. A heavy collective breath hitched in the throats of the audience. The wealthy investors seated near the front row stopped whispering. The arrogant smirks vanished from the faces of the bridesmaids. "Let us talk about Julian's incredible, generous charity," I said, allowing a razor-thin edge of absolute contempt to bleed into my tone. 3 years ago, exactly 1 week before Vanguard Tech was scheduled to launch its heavily publicized initial public offering, Julian made a critical, fatal error in his baseline security architecture. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a highly organized, heavily armed Eastern European cyber syndicate breached his impenetrable network. By 3:15 in the morning, they had successfully deployed a military-grade encryption protocol, entirely locking down every single gigabyte of his proprietary data, all of his client financial records, and the foundational source code of his entire empire. I paused, letting the devastating reality of those words sink into the minds of the board members and venture capitalists scattered throughout the room. I could see the blood physically draining from the faces of Julian's lead investors. The syndicate demanded a ransom of $25 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, giving him a deadline of exactly 72 hours before they would burn his life's work to the ground, I stated, walking closer to the head table where Julian was shrinking into his chair. My incredibly successful brother did not call the federal authorities. He did not call his elite corporate lawyers. He called me. He called me crying like a terrified child, begging me to save him because his multi-million-dollar company was exactly 3 days away from absolute, irreversible bankruptcy. I stopped directly in front of the head table. Julian was shaking visibly. He squeezed his eyes shut, totally unable to look at me, a pathetic portrait of a man whose hollow facade was collapsing inward. "I did not reset his Wi-Fi," I whispered into the microphone, though the sound system projected the dangerous hiss to the farthest corners of the ballroom. "I utilized classified intelligence clearance. I violated direct international protocols. I risked my federal badge, my freedom, and my absolute life to physically track that syndicate down to their servers. I walked into a room full of armed mercenaries, retrieved his decryption keys, and neutralized the threat. When I finally flew back to Austin, bleeding, fractured, and entirely empty, I collapsed on that leather sofa in his office. I passed out because I had just spent every ounce of my humanity pulling his fake empire from the ashes, and while I was unconscious, recovering from saving his entire world, he took a photograph to use as a prop for his narcissistic delusions. Suddenly, the screech of a heavy wooden chair violently scraping against marble shattered the tension. General Marcus Thorne stood up abruptly. The immense, terrifying presence of the decorated commander seemed to swallow the room. His chest heaved as the horrifying pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in his tactical mind. He ignored everyone else and stared intensely at my brother. "Good God!" General Thorne boomed, his deep voice shaking with a potent, unbridled fury. "The rogue infiltration mission on the border that winter, the one where you almost faced a military tribunal for unauthorized engagement, the intelligence target was not a matter of national security. You did all of that. You risked a heavily classified international incident, just to save his corporate stock price." "Yes, General," I answered softly, never breaking my gaze from my brother. "I crossed the line to save my blood, and this is how he repays his debts." Julian finally broke. A strangled, pathetic sob escaped his throat. He completely collapsed forward, burying his face into his arms on the table. The sharp clatter of silver cutlery echoed as he knocked over his water glass. He looked so incredibly small, stripped entirely of his custom-tailored arrogance, exposed to his wealthy in-laws and his investors as an absolute fraud. He had shamelessly twisted the bloody, agonizing sacrifice of his own sister into a pathetic narrative of his own charity. all to stroke his weak, fragile ego in front of a woman who cared only for his bank account. Chloe stood frozen on the stage. The bright spotlight that she had demanded now felt like a brutal interrogation lamp. Her perfectly applied makeup could not hide the horrifying transformation of her face. The flush of triumphant red violently drained away, replaced by a sickly, translucent white. Her mouth opened and closed silently. She looked down at the massive, glittering diamond necklace resting against her chest, her eyes widening in pure terror as she finally realized the absolute truth. Every single ounce of the incredible wealth, the elite status, and the glamorous lifestyle she was currently parading around was not built on her husband's brilliance. It was completely constructed upon the blood, the sweat, the silent agony, and the ultimate sacrifice of the woman standing in front of her, the woman she had just spent an hour treating like infectious garbage. The entire grand ballroom was locked in a state of absolute paralysis. No one dared to breathe. The illusion of the perfect elite family had been brutally, surgically dismantled, leaving nothing but ugly, undeniable reality in its wake. I looked up at Chloe, who was trembling violently on the stage. I felt no anger toward her anymore. She was just a shallow, meaningless symptom of a much deeper disease. I raised my hand and gently placed the silver microphone down onto the pristine white tablecloth of the nearest table. The quiet thud resonated heavily. "You are right, Chloe," I said, my voice completely clear and carrying effortlessly through the dead silent room without any artificial amplification. "I do not belong in this high society. I belong to the world that keeps people like you sleeping soundly every night, completely ignorant, without ever knowing exactly who you are indebted to." The morning after the storm brought a surprisingly clear, brilliant blue sky over Austin. The heavy, suffocating humidity of the wedding reception was entirely gone, replaced by a crisp, cleansing breeze. I stood in the quiet, expansive marble lobby of the luxury hotel, my single black duffel bag resting securely by my feet. I had completely bypassed the lavish post-wedding farewell brunch happening in the garden courtyard. My flight back to reality was scheduled to depart in exactly 2 hours. Footsteps echoed softly against the polished marble floor. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Julian looked like a man who had not slept a single minute. His eyes were deeply bloodshot, swollen, and ringed with heavy, dark shadows. The custom Italian tuxedo was gone, replaced by a wrinkled gray sweater. He looked incredibly small, entirely stripped of the billionaire tech founder persona he had fought so ruthlessly to build. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. "Eliza," Julian started, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. "I had my corporate lawyers draft this at 5 o'clock this morning. It is a full transfer agreement, 40% of the voting shares of Vanguard Tech. It is worth tens of millions of dollars. It is yours. It was always supposed to be yours. Please, just take it. Let me make this right." I looked down at the expensive parchment paper extending from his trembling hands. A profound, heavy sadness washed over me. But it was not for myself. It was for him. He still did not understand anything at all. "I do not want your money, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, completely drained of the icy anger from the night before. "I never wanted the stock options, the luxury cars, or the invitations to your elite parties. When you called me 3 years ago, crying and begging for your life, I did not risk a federal treason charge for a financial payout." I stepped slightly closer, forcing him to meet my eyes. "I just wanted my older brother," I told him gently, the absolute truth hanging heavily in the quiet air. "I wanted a brother who would stand up in a room full of arrogant strangers and defend me when they tried to tear me apart. I wanted family. But you chose the illusion. You chose the approval of people who would abandon you the exact second your bank accounts dried up." Julian lowered the folder. A single tear escaped his bloodshot eyes and rolled down his pale cheek. "I am so sorry. Eliza, I was incredibly weak." "I know you were," I replied, picking up the strap of my duffel bag and placing it over my shoulder. "And I forgive you. Julian, I really do. I forgive you for all of it, but I am absolutely done bleeding to keep your illusions alive. I will never allow myself to be used as a convenient tool or a hidden ghost in your life ever again. This is where my watch ends. I turned my back on him and walked out through the heavy glass revolving doors. The bright Texas sun hit my face, immediately warming my skin. Waiting directly in front of the valet station was a sleek, black, armored SUV. General Marcus Thorne stood casually leaning against the passenger door, wearing civilian clothes but still radiating an undeniable aura of absolute command. As I approached, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy, sealed white envelope bearing the official crest of the Department of Defense. "Your transfer orders, Commander Guerrero," General Thorne said, emphasizing my new title as he handed the package to me. "It is a top-tier operational command position. No more hiding in the shadows of incompetent men. It is time you led your own division. We need people who know the actual value of loyalty." I took the envelope, a genuine, completely unburdened smile finally breaking across my face. "Thank you, General." I opened the heavy door and climbed into the vehicle. As the powerful engine roared to life and the driver pulled away from the curb, I looked out the side window and glanced into the side rearview mirror. Julian was standing completely alone on the grand steps of the hotel, clutching his worthless legal documents to his chest. As the car accelerated down the wide avenue, his figure grew smaller and smaller until he finally disappeared from my view entirely. I leaned back into the firm leather seat, took a deep breath, and finally felt the intoxicating, undeniable weight of total freedom. Thank you so much to our incredible listeners for joining us today on Maya Revenge Stories. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let us know in the comments section below. As a brief reminder, YouTube has completely removed our ability to earn advertising revenue. If you found today's story empowering and entertaining, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. Your generous donations are the only way we can pay our dedicated staff, help them feed their families, and allow us to continue producing the high-quality stories you love. You can easily help by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct PayPal link found in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for keeping our channel alive.